Take a tree, saw it into boards, and you get a surface so rough that a brush drags and skips across it. Peel off the bark instead, and it cracks in half the first time you try to fold it. You can do almost anything to a tree, and none of it gives you a sheet of paper. More than 2,000 years ago, workers in Han Dynasty China solved that problem. And their first move was the last one anyone would guess. They wrecked the material. They soaked it until it rotted. They boiled it until it fell to pieces. They pounded it until nothing was left but a gray mush that looked like wet lint. Then they dumped the whole mess into a vat of water. The goal was something dry and flat and smooth. And the single most important step was drowning it. In 1986, archaeologists in Gansu province in northwestern China opened a tomb that had flooded centuries earlier. The bones inside had dissolved. But lying where the dead man's chest had been, they found a scrap of something about the size of 2 postage stamps. It had a map on it, drawn in black ink. Mountains, a river, a road. It was made of hemp, the same plant people twisted into rope, and it had been in the ground for about 21 centuries. This is how they made it, step by step, from a pile of old rope and torn cloth to a finished sheet you could write on. Why every step was necessary, what the first sheets actually looked like, and why the man whose name is attached to the invention of paper was born roughly 200 years after that little map was drawn. Start with why anyone would bother. Around 220 BC, China's first emperor set himself a daily quota of paperwork, and the historian Sima Qian wrote it down. The emperor weighed his documents on a scale, and he would not rest until he had worked through the day's measure. Scholars later calculated that measure at roughly 60 pounds. 60 pounds of reading every day for a man who had just conquered a continent. That number tells you what writing was before paper. It was heavy. A document in early China was made of bamboo. Workers split the stalks into thin strips, each one about as long as your forearm and about as wide as your finger, then scraped and dried each strip until it would take ink. One strip held 1 column of characters, maybe 30 or 40. Anything longer than a note ran across dozens or hundreds of strips, laced together with silk cord or leather into a mat that rolled up like a window blind. One chapter of a book was a bundle you carried in both arms, a library moved by cart, and if the cord rotted or a mouse got to it, the strips scattered across the floor in no particular order, and the text was gone until somebody pieced it back together. At a Han Dynasty postal station called Shuangquanji, out in the desert near Dunhuang, archaeologists in the early 1990s dug up more than 20,000 inscribed strips of bamboo and wood. Those were the records of one remote outpost. One. The empire had hundreds. There was an alternative, and the rich used it. Silk. It was light and thin. It rolled up small, and ink sat on it beautifully. Silk maps buried in a tomb at Mawangdui in the 2nd century BC are still sharp enough to read today. The problem with silk was that silk was money. The Han government collected taxes in bolts of silk. It paid salaries in silk. It bought peace on the northern frontier by handing silk to nomad chieftains by the cartload. Writing a letter on silk was like writing a letter on a stack of cash. One small clue is worth pausing on because it points toward where the answer came from. The Chinese character for paper is written with a component that means silk thread. The word for paper was born in the silk workshops, and it may have been born before paper itself. Hold on to that. Now, look at what the official history of the Han says paper was made from. The passage is short. Tree bark, hemp scraps, old rags, worn out fishing nets. Read that list again. There is no bamboo in it. There is no silk. 3 of the 4 items are garbage. The kind of thing that got tossed behind a farmhouse or left rotting on a riverbank. And the 4th grows on trees for free. Somehow, that heap became the thing 60 pounds of bamboo could never be. A surface that weighed almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and held ink as well as silk did. So, how do you get from a pile of old rope to a sheet of paper? Nobody in the Han Dynasty wrote down the recipe. What follows is built from 2 kinds of evidence. The fibers in the oldest surviving fragments, which still carry the marks of how they were handled, and the Chinese paper-making tradition that came after, which kept the same basic steps for 2,000 years and eventually put them in writing. Where those 2 sources agree, the picture is solid. Where they do not, this video will say so. You start by cutting it up. The earliest Chinese paper that anyone has put under a microscope is hemp, and almost none of it came from fresh plants. It came from things that had already worn out. Frayed rope, cloth too thin to patch again, a fishing net that had torn one time too many. That was not thrift. It was labor. Pulling usable fiber out of a raw hemp stalk is miserable work. And, in a length of old rope, somebody had already done it. The fibers were separated, twisted, clean. The hardest job was finished before the papermaker ever picked it up. He still had to chop it short, with a knife on a block. And this one detail matters more than almost any other. Long fibers tangle. Drop them in water, and they knot into clumps. And clumps never spread into a flat, even sheet. Keep that in mind, because decades from now, it will be the center of a fight over a famous find near Xi'an. No cutting, no paper, just a wad of hemp. Once the pieces were short, they went into water and stayed there. Days, sometimes weeks, in a pond or a pit dug beside a river, often with lime or wood ash stirred in. The batch began to stink. Anyone who walked past held their breath. But the man tending it would have crouched down and smelled it on purpose. Because the stink was the point. Plant fibers do not come loose on their own. They are glued together by natural compounds. The same stuff that makes a green stem stiff and a strip of bark hold its curve. To get single fibers, you have to dissolve that glue. And 2 things do it well: rot and alkali. Bacteria in stagnant water chew through the binding compounds slowly. Lime and ash water attack them chemically. A Han papermaker did not know the chemistry. He knew the smell. And he knew that if he pulled the batch too early, it would never beat down right. The clearest description of this step comes from much later. In 1637, a Ming Dynasty writer named Song Yingxing published a manual of Chinese crafts, and he laid out the making of bamboo paper in full. Cut bamboo was soaked for more than 100 days. Then it was boiled with lime for 8 days and 8 nights. That was 15 centuries after the first hemp sheets, with a different plant. And the logic had not moved an inch. Soak it until it gives up. Then cook it. Boiling finished what the soaking started. Hot ash water in a cauldron. The softened fiber turning slowly in it. The last of the plant glue letting go. What came out was a limp gray mass. Something like wet cotton that had been dragged through mud. There was no rope left. There was only fiber. The next step was the one that broke backs. Beating. This sounds pointless. The fiber is already soft. Already separated. Already falling apart in your hands. Why pound it? Because soaking and boiling pull the fibers away from each other. But beating does something to each individual fiber. It crushes it. It splits the ends and roughs up the surface until every strand is fuzzy with tiny threads, the way a piece of string frays when you roll it between your fingers. Those fuzzy threads are what will lock the sheet together later. Skip the beating, or quit early, and the paper comes out soft and crumbly, something you could push a thumb through. The tool was a mallet and a stone mortar, or a heavy wooden pestle on a foot lever. The worker stepping down, letting it fall, stepping down again, for hours. In the woodcut illustrations that go with Song Yingxing's manual, a man sits hunched over the mortar doing exactly that. The image barely changed across 2,000 years. Whoever beat the fiber for that little map in Gansu had the same sore shoulders. And now the step from the beginning of this video, the one that sounds backward. The whole beaten mass went into a vat of clean water and was stirred until the water turned cloudy. Anyone watching for the first time would ask the obvious question. The point is to make something dry. Why are you soaking it again? Because there is no other way to spread millions of tiny fibers into an even layer. You cannot do it with your hands. You cannot do it with a rake or a comb. But suspended in water and stirred, the fibers drift apart and settle into a random, even cloud, every one pointing a slightly different way. The water does the arranging. The vat is the invisible mold. And when the water drains away, something happens that the Han papermakers could not have explained but absolutely relied on. As the fibers dry, they shrink and pull tight against each other. And wherever one fiber touches another, the two surfaces bond. No glue is involved. The bond forms between the fibers themselves. And the more the fiber has been beaten, the more surface there is to grab with. That is why a sheet of paper does not crumble back into dust when it dries. That is also why beating could never be skipped. Getting the fibers out of the water as a flat layer took a mold. And the mold is the part of this story almost nobody talks about. The early version floated. A wooden frame with coarse cloth stretched across it sat on the surface of the vat like a raft. The worker ladled pulp onto the cloth, spread it with his palms, and lifted the frame out. Water ran through the weave, and fiber stayed behind. Then the frame had to sit somewhere, cloth and all, until the sheet was dry enough to peel. One mold, one sheet, and a long wait between them. Early paper shows it, thick in one place and thin in another, rough on top, and sometimes the weave of the cloth pressed into it like a fingerprint. The later version changed everything, and it was a small change to look at. The frame held a fine screen of thin bamboo strips laid side by side and stitched together with silk or horsehair. And instead of floating, the worker plunged the whole thing down into the vat and brought it up through the pulp, shaking it once side to side so the fibers settled and locked. Water poured out between the strips. A wet sheet lay on the screen. Then came the trick. He turned the screen over, pressed the wet sheet down onto a growing stack, peeled the screen away clean, and went straight back into the vat. Again and again. The frame never stopped working. One worker, one mold, and by the end of the day, a stack of sheets as tall as his knee. The historian Xian Cuen Xuin, who spent most of his life on the history of Chinese paper, called the dipping mold the decisive step, the thing that turned paper from something a village could make into something an empire could run on. You can still see it in the sheets. Hold a piece of Eastern Han paper up to the light, and faint parallel lines run through it. The shadows of those bamboo strips. Papermakers still call them laid lines. Which brings back that clue from the silk workshops. Because many scholars think this is where the whole idea came from. Making silk means boiling cocoons and unwinding the thread. But not every cocoon unwinds. The broken ones, the tangled ones, the leftovers, were dropped into water on a bamboo mat and beaten with sticks until the fibers spread into a soft floss that could be pulled off and stuffed into quilts. And when the floss was lifted away, a thin film of stray fibers stayed behind on the mat. Let it dry, and it peeled off in one piece. Thin, flat, smooth, and it would take ink. Nobody set out to make that film. It was a byproduct of a different job, but a worker who noticed it, and then noticed that cheap hemp beaten on the same mat left the same film, had just found the idea. That is why the character for paper carries silk in its name. The word was a receipt for where the idea was born. This is a theory, and no one can prove a single worker ever had that thought. But the lifted screen, the wet layer, the film that dries into a sheet, all of it was already sitting in the silk shops, waiting. What was left was pressing and drying. The stack of wet sheets was weighted down, sometimes with a lever and stones, until most of the water squeezed out. Then, each sheet came off one at a time, brushed flat against a warm plaster wall or laid out in the sun, and left alone until it lifted away dry. That was paper. It did not look like it. It was brown or gray, stiff, thicker at one edge than the other. Flecks of unbeaten fiber were caught in it like hairs. Bits of the original rope showed through if you knew where to look. The Feng Maton map is like this. Studies of its surface point to fibers that were deliberately cut and worked and formed into a sheet. But the work was rough compared with what came a few centuries later. And exactly how it was made is still argued over. Set it next to a sheet from a modern printer, and you would never guess they were the same thing. Which raises a real problem for the people who dig these things up. A scrap like that spends 2,000 years in wet ground. It comes out brown, turn, flattened, half-rotted. How do you tell the difference between the oldest paper in the world and a handful of rags that happen to get buried? The first time that question came up, it came up by accident. In 1957, a bulldozer was clearing ground for a brick factory at a place called Bakiao, on the edge of Xi'an. The blade turned up a clay jar. Inside was a bronze mirror, and under the mirror, packed in as padding, were a few flattened wads of yellowish-brown fiber. The tomb was Western Han, 2nd century BC. Within a few years, Chinese newspapers were calling the Baqiao fragments the oldest paper in the world. And a sample went into a museum case under that label. Then the specialists got a closer look, and the trouble started. When researchers from China's National Paper Institute put the fibers under magnification, they could not find what they were looking for. The hemp had never been cut. The strands were long and tangled, bunched up the way rope fibers bunch when you crush them flat. There was no sign that anything had ever been stirred into water and lifted out on a screen. Their conclusion was blunt. This was not paper. It was a pad of hemp somebody stuffed under a mirror to keep it from rattling. Other scholars pushed back, and the argument has gone on for decades. It is not fully settled even now. The Baqiao fight forced a definition nobody had needed before. Paper is not a material. Hemp is a material. Paper is what happens to a material after a specific chain of steps. Cut, sewak, beat, suspend, lift, dry. A wad of hemp that skipped those steps is a wad of hemp, no matter how old it is. So for anything that comes out of the ground, the question is never what it is made of. The question is whether it went through the process. 9 years after Baqiao, the scrap from the opening of this video came out of the ground. and it passed a different kind of test. Fangmatan is a cemetery in the hills near Tianshui, in Gansu. And in 1986, archaeologists excavated 14 tombs there. 13 dated to the Warring States period, before China was unified. The 14th, Tomb 5, was early Western Han, from the first half of the 2nd century BC, and it had flooded long ago. The body inside had decayed to nothing, but resting where the chest would have been was a flat, fragile piece of fibrous material, 5.6 centimeters by 2.6, roughly 2 inches by 1, and on its surface, someone had drawn with a brush lines for mountains, a river, with a road running alongside it. This is what separated Fangmatan from Bakiao. The Bakiao wads were used as stuffing. The Fangmatan fragment had been used as a page. A person picked it up, dipped a brush in ink, and drew a map on it, which means that person already thought of it as something you could write on. Then it went into the grave with him, laid on his body, which suggests it was his. A map he had used, or a map of somewhere that mattered to him. The fragment is so small and so damaged that curators have never allowed a piece to be cut away for testing. Everything known about it comes from studying it whole. The fibers appear to be hemp. A few scholars have questioned even that, and at least one has argued the material might be silk. Most researchers who have examined it accept it as the oldest surviving piece of paper with anything drawn on it. Most, not all. The argument might have stayed stuck on single scraps forever. Except that, between 1990 and 1992, in the desert outside Dunhuang, archaeologists found a whole trash heap's worth. Xuanquanji was a Han relay station on the road west, the same outpost whose 20,000 bamboo strips came up earlier in this video. The site is so dry that garbage thrown out 2,000 years ago is still garbage today. Not dirt. Among more than 70,000 objects, the excavators pulled out hundreds of fragments of hemp paper, and the layers they came from ran from the 1st century BC into the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The fragments were not all alike, and that is the whole point. The oldest were thick and coarse, with uneven surfaces and loose fiber showing, and several had clearly been used as wrapping. One had been folded around a dose of medicine. The later ones were thinner, smoother, more even, and some of those later ones had writing on them. Names of drugs, personal names, a few lines of what looks like official correspondence. In one rubbish pit, at one desert station. You can watch paper change from something that held a packet of herbs into something a clerk wrote on. So the sequence was there. Before the year 105, there was hemp paper in China. It was being made. It was getting better. And at least some of it was being written on. The proof had been sitting in the ground at Fangmatan and Xuanquanji the entire time. And maybe at Bakiao too, which leaves the year 105 itself. And the man whose name has been attached to it for 19 centuries, his name was Cai Lun, and he was not a papermaker. He was a eunuch. He came from a poor family in Guiyang, in what is now Hunan province. And he arrived at the imperial court in Luoyang around the year 75. He was castrated, which was the price of entry, and given a low post running errands inside the palace. From there, his career rose and fell with the women he served. The first was Empress Dao. In the early 80s AD, she wanted her adopted son named heir to the throne, and standing in the way was the boy who already held the title and his mother, a consort of the emperor named Song. According to the official history of the later Han, Cai Lun was the man sent to interrogate Consort Song. The charges were invented. Consort Song and her sister were taken away, and both of them drank poison rather than face what came next. The heir was removed. Empress Dao's son took his place. Cai Lun was promoted. This is the man who would be credited with inventing paper. And there is no honest version of his story that leaves the Song affair out. The same history that records the paper records the interrogation. In the same biography. A few lines apart. By the year 89, he held a post called Director of the Imperial Workshops. He ran the palace factories that turned out swords, ceremonial weapons, tools, and fine objects for the emperor's household. The history says the work done under him was so good that later generations treated it as the standard. Whatever else he was a man who managed skilled craftsmen, understood materials, and had an eye for quality. Remember that, because it is the key to what he did next. In the first year of the Yuanxing era, which is the year 105, Cai Lun presented paper to Emperor He. The history describes it in one passage. It was made from tree bark, hemp scraps, old rags, and fishing nets. The emperor praised it. And from then on, people across the empire called it marquee-size paper. So here is the problem this whole video has been walking toward. The Fangmatan map is 200 years older. The Shuangquanji station had paper in its trash for generations before Cai Lun was born. If paper already existed, what did he actually present? The record tells us what went into the vat. It does not tell us what he did with it. But set that list of ingredients next to the man who ran the palace factories. And three things stand out. The first is bark. Every one of the older fragments is hemp, usually recycled hemp. And recycled hemp fiber is short and weak and makes rough, spotty sheets. Bark is different. The inner bark of the mulberry tree and of its cousin, the paper, mulberry, gives long, tough fibers that beat down into a fine pell, strong pulp. Paper made from it is smoother, takes ink more evenly, and lasts far longer. Bark is the first item on Cai Lun's list, and it is the one ingredient no one has found in the paper that came before him. The second is the workshop. A village papermaker had a vat, a mold, and whatever rags he could scrounge. The director of the imperial workshops had the palace factories, a trained workforce, and the power to set a standard and hold every batch to it. He could try one fiber against another. He could fix the soaking times and settle the beating. He did not have to invent the steps. He had the means to get them right, and to get them the same way every time. The third is the emperor. And this one may have mattered most. Before 105, paper was what you wrapped medicine in. It was the stuff of a desert clerk's scrap notes. After 105, paper was something the emperor himself had praised, and the palace itself produced, which meant it could carry an edict, a tax record, an official letter. The material did not change much in that moment. Its standing did. Cai Lun kept rising. After Empress Dao died, he attached himself to Empress Deng, who became regent for a child emperor. In the year 114, she made him Marquis of Longting. With the income of 300 households, the title stuck to the paper, and the paper carried his name to every corner of the empire. In the year 121, Empress Dowager Deng died. The young Emperor An took real power for the first time, and Emperor An was the grandson of Consort Song, the woman Cai Lun had interrogated 40 years before. The emperor ordered Cai Lun to report himself to the Ministry of Justice and answer for her death. The history records what he did in one sentence. He could not bear the humiliation. So he bathed, dressed in his full formal robes and cap, and drank poison. His title was abolished. One more thing about that history. It was compiled by a scholar named Fan Ye in the 5th century, more than 300 years after Cai Lun died, from earlier records that no longer exist. What happened inside his workshops? How many trials it took? Who actually stood at the vats? None of that survived. The paper is one short paragraph in a long life. The paper kept his name anyway, and it kept getting better without him. Late in the 2nd century, a craftsman from the coast of Shandong named Zuo Bo made sheets so fine that for a while people asked for Zuo Bo paper the way they had once asked for Marquise Cai's. His name lasted a few generations. Most of the others never had names at all. Old rope, torn cloth, a fishing net past its last season. Cut it small, soak it until it stinks. Boil it in ash water. Pound it until not a single thread is left. Stir it into a vat and lift a screen up through the cloud. Press the stack. Peel each sheet away. Paste it to a warm wall. And wait. That was the whole method. No glue. No loom. No single inventor. The oldest sheet anyone has found with a mark on it is smaller than your palm, with a map on it, drawn by someone whose name nobody will ever know, 200 years before the name that everybody does.